Sure. Can I go to the memo that was released on Friday, the NSM 20? I'm sure lots of people have questions on it. In it, the State Department says it's reasonable to assess that there could be violations, but of course saying not that there's no evidence of it. If it's reasonable to assess that there are violations, how does this affect State Department planning going forward? Should there be greater concern, greater restrictions potentially on weapons going forward?
So there's no policy change to announce, Sean. What the report makes clear is that first, to take a little bit of a step back, the report makes clear that this is a very complex and complicated battlefield. It is a very dense and urban setting. We are also dealing with a belligerent, in this case Hamas, that has a clear track record and history of co-locating itself with civilians and civilian infrastructure, using civilians as human shields. We've also made clear in the report that the IDF has undertaken steps to implement international humanitarian law obligations for the protections of civilians in the current conflict, including requirements that are related to distinction, proportionality, and others. But we also are clear in our report that it's reasonable to assess that defense articles covered under the National Security Memorandum have been used by Israeli security forces in instances that are inconsistent with its IHL obligations. But we also have no direct indication of Israel intentionally targeting civilians. But to take a step back, Sean, and I guess this addresses kind of your broader question, a country's overall commitment to international humanitarian law is not necessarily disproven by what may be individual IHL violations. And the most important thing here is that Israel does have a number of ongoing active criminal investigations pending, and there are hundreds of other cases under administrative review. Israel has taken steps to, and is taking steps to, hold itself and its actions accountable. Simultaneously, we also continue to have tools at our disposal that existed before the National Security Memorandum and existed afterwards. Things like the Churg process, the Leahy process, the conventional arms transfer policy, end-use monitoring, and other things to continue to assess and continue to look into instances that are reported to us that may be concerning. The same can be said about humanitarian aid. We continue to monitor that situation very closely, and will continue to assess the government of Israel by its actions as it relates to humanitarian aid.
Sure. Now, we say you have lots of tools at your disposal. I know you said that you think that the Israelis have taken action on their own. In the State Department's view, there's no intention there. But if it's reasonable to assess there have been that things have gone against the spirit of international humanitarian law, is there more that can be done? And particularly with this, if it's a question of not actually having evidence of it, will the State Department continue to probe and see if there is?
So we'll continue to look at the circumstances on the ground as we have prior to the National Security Memorandum was even signed. It's important to remember that the NSM did not outline or create any new parameters or mechanisms. Really, it was another assessment tool, and the tools that we have at our disposal will continue to exist. But again, Sean, it's important to remember that given the nature of what is happening on the ground, and given the nature of Hamas's track record of co-locating itself with civilians, using civilians as human shields, we're unable to make a conclusive determination as it relates to violations of international humanitarian law.
Just one more for me on this. I mean, in terms of the message that's being sent from this, what message do you expect Israel in particular to see from this? The fact that you're saying that there, not you personally, but the State Department is saying that there are potentially violations of the spirit, things that are going against international humanitarian law, but there's no firm evidence there, no repercussions. But what message do you think should be taken from this? Do you think there should be a sense of they should do more? They should do more they could do better potentially?
Absolutely. Our message continues to be what our message has been for some time, which is that the United States stands with Israel in its effort to defeat Hamas and hold the terrorists accountable for those that were responsible for the October 7th terrorist attacks. But simultaneously, there is a moral and strategic imperative to take every possible step to minimize civilian casualties, steps that we know that the IDF has the tools and the capability to undertake, things that unfortunately are not being met in certain instances, but simultaneously that this is also a belligerent that is using civilians as human shields, and therefore we've not been able to come to any kind of conclusive conclusion on this. And on the humanitarian aid front, we'll continue to press all regional partners, including the government of Israel, to do everything we can to get more humanitarian aid into Gaza. Camilla.
Thank you. Just sticking on the National Security Memorandum,
Sure.
Would you, I mean, you've mentioned CHUG, you've mentioned that the State Department has its own internal process of assessing cases for Israel and other countries that are in conflict. Would you say that the National Security Memorandum has at least been a useful tool for the State Department in being able to bring forward some of these conclusions in a public light, whereas perhaps your other internal processes wouldn't have necessarily done so or wouldn't plan on doing so anytime soon?
So I think the important thing to remember here, Camilla, is that no new standards were imposed. Instead, the National Security Memorandum was a tool that spelled out already existing standards set by U.S. policy and set by international law, including the law of armed conflict, that countries must adhere to. This is, we view the National Security Memorandum as now another tool in our tool belt to assess circumstances on the ground and to, in this particular case, assess the use of U.S. security articles in a particular battlefield. But I think the important thing to remember is that we didn't issue this memorandum because we thought any country was necessarily violating these standards. Instead, we wanted to be transparent about the standards that we require countries to adhere to and offer an assessment of a certain time period that the National Security Memorandum is consistent with.
Can I just one on something that was mentioned
Sure.
in the report released on Friday? It said that 40% of the Israel-Gaza related cases within the State Department's CHUG process are now closed. Can you give us an idea of what closed means? Does that mean that some of them have gone through to the Leahy process? Have others gone? Other cases been deferred back to Israel for them to come to some kind of conclusion or agreement on what could be improved or done better? How do we assess the word closed there with those 40%?
So I will check for specifics, Camilla, but the important thing to remember about the CHUG process is that there are a number of outputs that can be at the end of a CHUG process, some of them including the Leahy process. Some of it could be consultations with the government through our bilateral relationship. Some of those outputs could be additional training. So I'm not going to speak to the deliberative process in specificity beyond just saying that we continue to have tools at our disposal to look at this, and we have every intention to do so, and we make that very clear in the National Security Memorandum that we'll continue to use the tools at our disposal to continue to look at the situations on the ground, look as this conflict develops, but also look at the flow of humanitarian aid and the protection of civilians as well.
Can I just clarify a couple
Sure.
things you said?
Let me do it, and then I'll come to you, Said.
Sorry. On the raising with Israel, the incident on aid trucks, that was today's incident. Is that right?
Yes.
Clarifying, you didn't mean more generally. And then who raised with who?
As you know, I'm not going to get into the specifics of these conversations, but we talk to our partners in Israel all the time, around the clock, and have intend to raise issues like this when they come up.
And then you told Sean that a country's overall commitment to international humanitarian law is not necessarily disproven, but by what may be individual IHL violations. there have been accusations for dozens of incidents. If all those end up being violations, can you still say Israel is fulfilling its commitment to abide by IHL?
That is, I'm just not going to get ahead of a hypothetical. We are talking about things that are still mid-process in some instances, but again, in the context of the National Security Memorandum, given the circumstances on the ground, we have not been able to make a conclusive determination. But again, just given what we are seeing, it is fair to assess that there have been instances in which Israel has not held up its obligation of complying with international humanitarian law. We will continue to pursue these kinds of things through the tools that exist in the United States, but Israel has also indicated that it will continue to pursue accountability through the mechanisms that exist in its own government. And they have indicated to us that they have hundreds of cases open, including some that are in administrative review and some that are in the middle of prosecution, and we'll let them speak to those processes.
But given all that, do you still feel Israel is fulfilling its commitment to IHL and that it is committed to it?
That's our understanding. Yes, that's what we believe. Said, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Just to follow up on Kamala's point. Now, you're saying that, okay, they likely broke the law, but not enough to change policy. So what is the point of the report? I mean, in simple terms, what is the point?
I think I answered that question,
I understand.
Said.
I just want to hear...
If you understand, then why are you asking?
No, I want to hear, your justification for if you have the report out there, policy is not going to change. There is to be breaking the law, and so on. You are likely to have.
That's not what the report says, Said.
So
the report is public.
Says they did not likely break the law.
The report says, first of all, let me just be clear about what this is. The National Security Memorandum does not impose any new standards. We spelled out the existing standards that have already existed, set by U.S. policy and international law. And that what we expect countries and partners to adhere to when they receive weapons from the United States. As it relates to Israel, the report does not determine that Israel has violated international humanitarian law. But we believe through various assessments of instances that it is likely that in these instances they have failed to meet their obligations of meeting international humanitarian law. But that is a process that's going to continue both through the tools that are at our disposal and at tools in which the Israeli government has to hold itself accountable.
So when the president of Israel, Herzog, said there are no civilians in Gaza, that's what he said. When Gallant says, they're human animals and we're going to wipe out Gaza, those were his words. When the Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu, says, the Amalek spare no one, kill the children, do all that, that is not enough evidence that they were planning. They were planning.
As upsetting as it might be for you, this is not a report on rhetoric.
Okay.
This is a report on the facts on the ground, and the facts on the ground are there are civilians in Gaza. I would dispute with anybody making that claim. Yeah. But two, what we're talking about is what the facts are, and the facts are that we are dealing with a belligerent that uses civilians as human shields, has a long track record of co-locating itself with civilians and civilian infrastructure, and thus it has not been possible to make a conclusive assessment. However, we do not determine that Israel has violated international law, but what we are saying, Said, is that one, Israel has had to confront an extraordinary military challenge, but that simultaneously it is reasonable to assess that Israeli security forces since October 7th, there have been instances that are inconsistent with its international humanitarian law obligations. And the United States will continue to look at instances on the ground through the tools that are at our disposal, but also our partners in Israel have indicated to us that they will continue to take steps to look into this through their own system as well.
Let me just a couple more questions, if you indulge me. The president said yesterday, we were talking about the negotiations and, is there a deal in the offing or no deal? The president said that Hamas could have a ceasefire now if they wanted to, if they release the hostages. But there was a deal, basically the American deal, to which Hamas agreed, that would have done this last week or 10 days ago and so on. But it was rejected by Israel. Isn't that the case?
That's absolutely not the case.
Not the case. So what is the case?
Again, over the course of this, it has been very clear that Hamas has continued to move the goalposts on this, and will reiterate what you've heard many others say from up here, including the secretary, that this conflict could be over yesterday if Hamas simply came out of the tunnels, laid down its arms, or at minimum took the deal that had been on the table for quite some time. We're going to continue to work at this. We continue to think a ceasefire is possible, one that is coupled with the release of hostages and additional humanitarian aid.
So the ball now is in Hamas's court.
That is correct. It has always been in Hamas's court.
Always been. Okay, one last thing. I don't know if you saw the CNN report on the prisoners. They strapped down, blindfolded, held in diapers. Israeli whistleblowers detail abuse of Palestinians in shadowy detention center. Are you aware of this report?
I've seen those reports cite, and we're concerned by them. We're looking into these and other allegations of abuse against Palestinians in detention. And we've been clear and consistent with any country, including Israel, that it must treat all detainees humanely, with dignity, in accordance with international law, and it must respect detainees' human rights. And so we have reiterated that Israel has an obligation to thoroughly investigate credible violations of international humanitarian law. Jillian, go ahead. You've had your hand up for some time. Sorry about that.
That's okay. I wanted to get a response. Senator Chris Van Hollen said after reading the report that there's enough on the books to be able to point to specific cases and make specific determinations, and on that score the administration is ducking the hard questions in the report. Do you have a response to that?
So we are pretty clear in our report that the nature of conflict in Gaza and the fact that Hamas uses civilian infrastructure for military purpose makes it difficult to assess or reach conclusive findings on individual incidents. So while we found it reasonable to assess that there have been instances where Israel has not acted consistent with IHL or acted consistent with best practices for civilian harm mitigation over the course of the conflict, the report doesn't reach a conclusive finding because of this very difficult and challenging battlefield environment, as well as the kind of belligerent that we are dealing with. And we have been very clear about that. We have also laid out in the full national security memorandum the other tools that we have at our disposal to assess situations on the ground, not just in Israel, but in any conflict zone, as we do when it comes to violations of international humanitarian law. Those processes continue to be ongoing.
So you keep mentioning that the report makes the administration's position and findings clear. I guess on the flip side of the coin, you have folks like Senator Tom Cotton. His reaction to the report was, he said it's very clear there's no evidence Israel is violating international law. All civilian casualties in Gaza are solely the responsible of Hamas. Given these divergent interpretations of this report, do you think State Department's going to take any steps to clarify those findings further with the Hill or?
Well, I really can't speak to the general confusion among Congress. That's for them to clarify or seek clarification on what is confusing for them. Our report lays out pretty clearly especially the section on the conflict in Gaza. But of course, in the course of this whole conversation, we'll continue to engage with Congress on areas of concern or on questions that they have. And I have no doubt that process will move forward, but I don't have any specifics to share on that.
Is that what Senator Cotton laid out? Is that the correct or accurate? Is that an accurate reflection of the report?
I will let the senator clarify his own comments. What I can say from here is what I have reiterated to your colleagues, which is that there have we have not been able to reach or assess conclusive findings on individual incidents, but we find that it is reasonable to assess that there have been instances when Israel has not acted consistent with international humanitarian law or acted consistent with the best practices for civilian harm mitigation. But we'll continue to look at this conflict through the tools that we have at our disposal, and Israel has indicated that it will do so as well.